we saw that we can put in some values or pass in values into functions, but let's see what we can get out of the functions. And for getting values out of functions, we can use return statement. And we can call it that we return value or values from the function. So basically, we take in some values, we can do something based on the values, and we can return some value. So basically, a simple function can be that you take two numbers, a and b, and we return the sum of those two values. So basically, that's what the function is. The Python always returns something in a function. Even if we don't write a specific statement, the function always returns something. And to return something, you can use a return statement. If we don't have this return statement, as we did in our earlier examples, the default value which is returned is none. So basically, every time you don't write return value, it actually kind of acts as you would have return none in your code. And how to use this return statement? So basically, we have a function called the triangle area, which calculates the area of a triangle. And we get two values. We get the base and the height of the triangle. And we calculate the function, calculate the area, and return it. So basically, return. After the return, we can have an expression. And now what happens is that we can use this function to, or we can put the result of this function into a variable. So yeah, basically the variable s is where we store the result of this function. So currently we can say that we put in or pass in values, let's say 10 and 5. Those are two values. And now what comes out is that we multiply those and divide by 2. So it should be 25. So I get out 25 from this function. And now basically the function or the variable s becomes 25. And now I can print out the value, or I can use it in another calculation and so on. Here is an example which is more complex. And the idea here is that we can return multiple values with return statement. And we just separate them by comma. And actually what happens is that it returns tuple. The data type, what it returns is tuple. We will talk about tuple in a separate video. But the code itself, what it actually does is that it takes a string quadratic formula, and as shown here, and it tries to find different multipliers for the square multiplier, the linear multiplier, and the constant multiplier here. This is very simplified solution for that. So if the order of those different parts is different, then it doesn't work. So basically it requires us to have the square element as the first one and so on. And we just use basic string operations. We find out where the x square is, then we find where the x is after this x square part, and we use slicing here, and then we replace the spaces, and then we can convert those strings into integers. But the main part here is that we will calculate a, b, and c, or those are the multipliers, and return those three values here, separated by comma. And now we can use it in two different ways. So basically one way would be that we call this function, and I assign the result into three values. What happens is that if the function returns three values, I can put every value into separate variable. It requires us that the number of elements on both sides are the same. So I cannot have two values here and put them into three variables. This would give us an error. So basically I have to know that this function returns three values. The other way would be to put the whole value into one variable, which is multipliers. And now if I print it out, I can see that those values are put into parentheses. So basically that's the form of tuple. So that's how a tuple is represented. There are several values and those are inside parentheses. Here, if I print those three values out, those are separated by space. So we can return several values and we can use those values separately, put them into separate variables, or we can put them all together into one variable, which is tuple in that case. So here are the same comments about the previous code. So we take an expression, which is a string, then we find the multipliers, function returns three values, and those three values can be put into three different variables, or we can put them into one variable, which is basically a tuple. One thing to note also is that the variables inside and outside the function are different, although I have named those differently. So here we use one A and here are two A's, just to be more clear with this code. But actually I could use one A and one B and one C also here. Those are two different variables. So everything I declare inside the function remains inside the function. So after the function ends, this variable is deleted from the memory. And it doesn't overwrite anything outside of the function. There are ways to kind of modify variable values from inside the function to outside, but this is not usually nice to do, or it's not often you would want to do that. So the return statement actually finishes or ends the function. Here we can see that there is a function get university name, and the parameter it takes is an abbreviation. So based on the abbreviation, we will find out what is the name of the university. Here we used just some conditional sentences, and what happens is that if one of those conditionals is true, we will go in to this body of this condition sentence, and inside this we will have return. What return does is that it finishes the execution of this function. So after this return statement, we will not continue with this function execution. So there is, for example, there is a print sentence which says that it's unknown abbreviation. We won't get there if we reach here or here or here. So basically, because the return statement ends the function, we don't have to use if and else statements here. We can just use if. And if none of those three first conditionals are true, then we reach here. Then it prints out that it's an unknown abbreviation, and it returns other. So basically, in three cases, we will get the name of the university, and if we pass anything else here, we just get the value other. Now, in the previous example, I had both print and return. And often it's, in the beginning, it makes a lot of, it's not very clear how those two are different, or are they different? That's the question. Actually, they are pretty different, and the return statement can be used inside functions only. So I have to be inside the function to use this return statement. And what it does, it finishes the execution of this function, and it also returns the result. So there is no way to get this out value here. The only way to get something out of the function is by returning it. The print, in the other hand, is just a function itself, and we can call this function. So there is somewhere in the Python code, there is a definition for this function, print function. And the print function just prints out something on the screen. And why is this different? So for example, if you print something out and you return something, for you it might seem that it's basically the same because you can see what is printed out. But the print, although it's printing by default into the screen, it could also print into file or into web or, I don't know, into paper in some examples. So the print can happen wherever. And what's the main difference is that the out or the return value, this can be used by the program. So I can assign this out or this result into some variable and do additional calculations. But what's printed on screen, I cannot use it. I mean, I could, but it's really complicated. It's very hard for a program to actually read from the printed out or from the screen. So it's very hard to actually read what was printed out. It's doable, but it's not worth the effort. So we usually just use return in that sense if we want to get something out of the function. So here's an example. We use the same triangle area calculation. The first one does the calculation and prints this code out or the result out. What happens is that I can call this function here. I can see the output is 50. It seems correct. Now the question is, I want to print out what is the area, and I cannot do it. And why it is printing out none? It's printing out none because the none is the default return value. As I don't have any return value in this code here, we can say that the next line would be the same as return none. And what happens is that if I assign the result of this function into a variable, the none will be the value for this variable. And if I print out the area, I will get none. Instead, if I would use a correct way to return value using return statement, I can get the result into this variable, and now I can use this value inside my code. I can print it out, I can calculate additional things with this variable and so on. So we use print only to get some feedback for ourselves. For computers, the print doesn't matter. You don't have to use print at all. But for a programmer, it's nice to have something on the screen. Then you can verify, okay, that seems legit, and you can continue with programming. But we have to use return to be able to use those values from the functions in our program later on. Here's an example. Basically, the idea is the same, but now we use both print and return. So basically, again, we will calculate the area of a triangle. Here what we do, we kind of print out that we got some values, then we are calculating the area, then we will sleep just 1 second. There is no point to do that, but it's just cool. So it gives us like an idea that the computer is actually calculating, although it's quite easy calculation for the computer. Now we actually calculate area, then we print out that it's done, and we also print out what was the value or what was the calculation or the result of the calculation, and then we return this value. Now if I call out this function, I will get several lines of code into screen. So it prints out that it's calculating, it even waits 1 second and so on. but still the result in this variable is only this value here. So what is returned, this is what becomes the output of this function. And now I can do additional stuff with my variable area. Now I just print it out in this code here. So we can use print several times in a function, but it actually doesn't affect the function in the sense that it doesn't end the function. It usually even doesn't affect different values or different calculation. It's just something to put on the screen. And the return is what we have to use to actually return some meaningful value from the function. The return can also be used with an expression. So we already had those examples, but basically you can, instead of just returning one value or one variable, we can return an expression. Currently it's calculating some secret result. And in those cases, there is no point to have a separate variable just because you want to return it. There are different problems. For example, one problem is how to name this extra variable here. Because usually we should use meaningful names for the variables. In this case, it would be maybe hard to just come up with an additional name for this variable. So instead, if you want to return an expression, just return the expression. There is no point to calculate it into a separate variable and then return it. If I would like to use this calculation inside this function in a different way, then of course it would make sense to put it into a variable and then use it inside the next calculation and then return it. But if you create the variable and use it only once, usually there is no point to declare this variable. So just use the expression instead.